Apicius' cookbook listed defrutum, a fruit syrup, as a staple to preserve foods. Pretty clever for no fridge, right? Forget lava heat. Roman ice hunters actually braved the snow-capped Apennines to haul blocks back to Rome like a very cold delivery truck.
Aha, Doodles.
So they fetched ice from the chilly Apennines, packed in deep straw like a retro cooler for their fancy feasts. So these snow haulers would brave the Apennines, freezing water into blocks to stash in straw-lined pits. Basically DIY walk-in freezers for their summer feasts. Roman engineers cleverly built these underground storage rooms, or horrea, near the city of Gabii, to keep their food fresh. Since ice was priceless, the snow haulers packed it in straw like a giant, chilly cooler bag to save every last chunk. So instead, they'd boil grape juice down to a sticky, sweet glaze called defrutum, basically the ancient version of a thick fruit jam. When food spoiled fast, Romans shipped massive salt blocks from Spain, turning tough meat into durable rations their legions chewed like beef jerky. This salty pay made salary from sal, proving even ancient generals needed a little cash for their chunky snacks. Romans relied on salt from places like the evocative Salini, near modern-day Droitwich in England, to season and preserve food. In fact, the empire famously paid armies with salt, earning them the Latin nickname salarium, which is where we get the word salary. So while salt bankrolled their salaries, that monthly stash also bought them garum to ditch the bland legionary beanbags. Like Apicius, a famous Roman chef, they used salt to preserve meat and make dishes like patina, a fancy fish stew. That salt tax was so heavy, soldiers even got paid partly in salt, earning the modern word salary for today's boring paychecks. The Romans also used a process called defrutum, a fruit syrup, to preserve foods like grapes and berries. But the real sweet stockpile was defrutum, thick grape syrup boiled down daily to thicken wine and mask bad flavors. Grinding wild herbs like silphium into a sharp paste helped mask the smell of meat that hasn't seen a fridge in ages. They packed honey into jars with fruit, a sweet seal that stopped rot, while keeping snacks shiny like polished coins. Soldiers also baked hard, shelf-sturdy biscuits called bucellatum that lasted years, basically making the original crunchy travel snack for board trips. They also spiced fresh grapes with pepper and honey to make a tart relish that screamed party mix to any hungry toddler. Instead, they caught the fermented, smelly fish guts right from the garum vats to keep their food safe for months. They also buried clay pots of seasoned meat in underground ice cellars, turning Roman houses into surprisingly chill, primitive fridges long before electricity showed up, where they just smoked wild boar in special kills, turning tough meat into chewy jerky that lasts longer than your low battery warning, where they pumped up simple lentil stews with sharp vinegar to halt the spoil, basically ancient pavlova without the sugar crash. And when salt was too boring, they buried fish guts in wax jars, essentially freezing time for their protein with zero electricity needed. Marcus Gavius Apicius wrote about salting meats in his famous cookbook, basically the Roman version of a food blogger. That salty method even helped the British legions stash their pork in barrels lined with straw, basically 3D printed lunchboxes in clay, where they packed pickled mushrooms in honey jars, turning forest fungi into shelf-stable snacks before the first snow ever fell. While the wealthy rushed to their fancy underground wine cellars, regular folks just relied on salted fish to keep dinner from turning into a science experiment. And let's not forget the dormice, fattened in tiny clay homes called gloraria for a very specific, crunchy snack attack. The Roman cookbook De Re Coquinaria has a recipe for a turnip dish, which Apicius likely made with cheaper alternatives, like lentils, to save a buck. Instead, wealthy Romans kept stores of fresh figs and honey, turning summer sweetness into a portable snack that never needed a mini fridge to stay tasty. They even threw rosemary into salted jars, turning simple herbs into a zesty road trip snack that beat your plastic Tupperware every time. Where they buried clay pots deep in cool cellar dirt, basically using the earth as the original slow-motion icebox for their messy lunches. So they dried grapes into raisins or cooked fruit with honey and sand and alls, creating a sweet, shelf-stable treat like ancient fruit snacks. They use a method like sun-dried tomatoes, making fruit leather to store for later, like a healthy, ancient fruit roll-up. They soaked plums in boiled grape must, a sticky thickener that acted like ancient, fruity Kevlar against the heat. They'd spread figs on warm stone to dry, creating sweet leather pouches that survived heat better than a smartphone in a parking lot. And for a sweet boost, they stuffed figs with walnuts, creating ancient energy bars better than any granola brick you can buy. They also buried jars of honey-glazed dates in cool cellars, keeping them sweet for months without a single drop of modern electricity needed. They used insulating clay pots to keep food cool, like ancient thermoses on a summer picnic. They turned salty fermented fish into garum, a zesty sauce so popular even the poor couldn't afford date night without it. They also sealed figs in clay jars with honey, creating ancient duds that stayed fresh for years without warming up. But for sweet stuff that needed boiling, they used sapa, a thick syrup that basically turned grapes into ancient jam jars we'd all steal from the pantry. And for their daily bread, they slathered on olive oil and garum, a funky fish sauce ancient Romans rated higher than your favorite ketchup bottle. They also spiked water with honeyed figs to make a sweet sip called conditum, basically the ancient version of a fizzy juice box you'd fight your sibling for. Think of it as a honey-sweetened soda, but without the fizzy bubbles since carbonation was mostly a lucky accident back then. They also mixed honey into young wine for mulsum, a spicy, ready-to-drink treat that felt like a fancy smoothie. Actually, they buried fish sauce vats in the hot Pompeii sun to ferment the guts into a savory, stinky umami bomb. That intense fishy sauce even showed up on fancy menus as a spicy dipping option for every meal at every Roman restaurant. Roman peasants also used clay pots to preserve food, like ancient Tupperware. They hung cured meats in the smokehouse, letting the smoky air do the heavy lifting like a natural fridge, setting the table on fire. That thick smoke layer acted like an invisible, edible raincoat, blocking the greedy bacteria from throwing a party on your dinner. Those woods also injected specific antimicrobial compounds, like guaiacol from oak, giving the meat a smoky flavor we still crave on BBQs today. So when the heat waves hit, they turned to smoking meats over specific woods to lock in flavor without a single electricity bill. They even used a process called coppa to cure pork necks, kind of like a pre-refrigerator prosciutto. Roman cooks used defrutum to glaze meats like a sweet and sour fig syrup before dumping them in garum for extra flavor. When that glaze failed, they didn't panic. They just buried it in salt caves like a time capsule for later. They tried preserving meats with a method called defrutum, a fruit syrup that was like ancient jam, but savory and handy too. But spices were pricey, so they also packed moldy cheese inside hollowed-out pumpkins to hide the smell until the next market day. Then trade guilds shipped dried figs stuffed inside hollowed-out goat skins, a clever trick that kept snacks safe from summer heat, much like a sub sandwich in a sealed bag. They also packed veggies in honey or vinegar. Imagine a Roman snack pack that didn't crumble when you shook it around in a cart. They even buried root veggies in sand to stay crisp, basically ancient time capsules you could dig up for a snack. They also shoveled salt into pork pits, letting the brine do the heavy lifting for months of salty snacks. They also buried their cooked fruit in actual ash heaps, creating a smoky, campfire-style dessert that hid perfectly from hungry bugs. For salt, they paid a premium, sometimes so expensive it nearly melted your wallet faster than a sundae on a hot Roman day. That price tag was steep, like buying a smartphone with a golden case just to sprinkle on your lentils. Actually, they poured savory fish sauce, garum, over stews so the salty brine acted like a natural preservative for days. But the boring, salty truth is that regular folks just dunked cheap bread in vinegar to kill any gross bacteria hiding in their dinner. Quite the icky snack, right? The rich used mountain spring cellars, but most folks packed veggies in sand pits, like a prehistoric fridge that never needed a power bill. For a quick chill, patrons literally broke off blocks from snow dumps to cool their drinks, proving ice cream was once a rare, frosty luxury. Romans used special clay pots called dolia to store food, keeping it fresh for months, like ancient Tupperware. Roman chef Apicius shared tips on preserving seafood with salt and herbs, giving ancient Romans a tasty seafood option year-round. So they skipped the icebox, tossing fresh catches into giant clay jars where the sun turned them into garum, a runny fish sauce that smelled like a low-tide party. This smelly brine paired perfectly with their fancy honeyed dormice, proving Romans loved a gross combo just as much as we do today. That soupy mess called garum was basically ancient fish sauce that took months to turn into a savory umami bomb. They dumped buckets of fish guts into sun-baked clay jars right next to the road, letting nature do the heavy lifting. They called this funky fish sauce garum, a staple in Roman kitchens, kind of like ketchup is for us today. Fact check, it actually took months to ferment, turning tiny fish into a funky brown sludge right in warm shops across Pompeii. Forget tanks of cash. That stash was pure gold dust for the poor ship captains who bottled the salty magic. That fermented fish sauce, garum, was so pricey it cost more than a modern craft beer. Yet everyone shoveled it on their bread. Since ice rooms were a luxury, folks stored grain in cool, dark storage pits called silos buried right in their homes. So they stacked these beans in ceramic jars called dolia, the ancient version of Tupperware, keeping pests out of the pantry. After packing them tight, they drizzled a splash of potent olive oil like a liquid airtight lid, just like your grandma's spice jars. The olive oil helped prevent spoilage, much like the process used in ancient Greek amphorae to store food for months. Then they sealed the jar with a cork, kind of like we seal our favorite snacks to keep them fresh for lunch tomorrow. Then they buried these jars deep in cool cellars, like a natural fridge that actually lasted way longer than a power outage. They even buried wine skins in the cold ground, creating a primitive, earthy AC unit for summer sips. And before snow trucks arrived, savvy Romans just hauled ice down from the Alps, paying gold dust for frozen dessert toppings. But digging deeper, Romans found volcanic stone caves near Pompeii that stayed a chilly 50 degrees perfect for hiding salad bowls. But let's be real, even the best volcanic caves couldn't keep a pomegranate fresh for weeks without turning it into a fuzzy science experiment. So they buried clay pots in cool earth, basically ancient fridges that kept olives crisp without needing a plug or a plug-in. While Galba loved fancy parties, most folks just used thick hay to wrap their melons so the summer heat didn't ruin the crunch. Enter Marcus Porcius Cato, who stored veggies in a cool, clay-lined cellar, like an ancient Roman root cellar. Genius. Marcus also cleverly used crushed ice from nearby mountains to chill his goodies. Talk about a cool move. In the ruins of Herculaneum, archaeologists discovered a 2,000-year-old fruit stash, including carbonized dates and grapes, remarkably preserved by the volcano's ash. Think of it as the original sun-dried tropical snacking, turning sour fruit into super sweet candy bars before candy bars existed. But here's the cheat code. They soaked those rock-hard figs in sweet wine to make them squishy again, like an ancient, boozy gummy bear. That dried sweetness became a perfect travel snack, handy enough to pack in leather bags that didn't need any batteries. Instead of fancy glass rooms, they just laid thirsty fruits on warm stone trays, letting the blazing Italian sun do the heavy lifting. Fruits like grapes and figs were perfect for this method, and the Romans even had a special word, possum, for raisin wine. They'd spread grapes on terracotta tiles called tesserae to sun-dry them, basically making ancient Instagram food pics that actually lasted months. So they often carried hard pulse cakes made from spelt wheat, which were basically ancient, dry power bars for hungry soldiers on the Long March. But back at home, the rich just snuck cool water from mountain springs into their fancy stone dining halls, basically nature's ancient AC unit for fancy feasts. Even regular folks sealed their jars with melted fat, a cheap trick keeping snacks fresh without needing a high-tech vacuum pump. Doodle: a cartoon Roman grandma happily smearing animal fat over a clay jar while holding a fish and laughing. Key: Roman food preservation fat sealing. Emotion: warm amusement. SFX: squish, squish, squish. And guess what? They also stuffed juicy figs into clay pots with olive oil, turning them into ancient, kid-friendly fruit snacks. They even mixed grapes with hot sand in jars to cook them off the vine, effectively baking candy before ovens were cool. They also dipped apples in honey and stored them in clay pots. Basically ancient fruit leather that lasted all winter long. But olive oil wasn't the only trick. They even soaked dormice in honey and roasted them, a weird snack that would make your inner foodie do a double take. Fresh eggs got buried in straw or ash, staying perfect for weeks, Basically an ancient, room-temperature fridge without the noisy humming. They also salted down tons of olives in ceramic jars, turning bitter nuts into a crunchy, Pernod-free snack for the whole legion. Romans also pickled veggies in vinegar like sauerkraut to make them last, kind of like your grandma's infamous Jared gifts. They also stored food in cool, dark cellars, like an ancient Roman root cellar, to keep it fresh for months. They even packed grapes in sealed clay jars with a splash of honey, turning summer treats into chewy, ancient gummy bears for the holidays. And don't think it was just fancy banquets. Even common sailors wiped down salted fish in clay pots to keep lunch safe during stormy voyages.